Guidance on Marijuana Sampling Procedures.
Presented by the Science and Policy Workgroup Sampling Subcommittee.
Introduction to Sample Collection. The purpose of testing and types of testing requirements.
Purpose. Colorado's marijuana rules, 1 CCR Part 4, require regulated marijuana businesses to participate in a regulated marijuana testing program. The purpose of this testing is to ensure that a marijuana product is ultimately safe for consumers. Testing at appropriate times in the grow process lessens the chance that a harmful substance becomes available to consumers and accumulated in a downstream product. Furthermore, legal sale and transfer of product can be held up without these passing test results. See Rules Section 4-105 for more information. Required tests. Potency. For potency, the cannabinoid label must match the content so that people can regulate their dose. On the left is an example of a cannabinoid report from a lab, and on the right is an example of how an unexpectedly high dose of THC affected public health. Another form of potency testing is homogeneity. This means that dosages must be evenly distributed throughout an infused product. Residual solvents. Residual solvents are most often used in concentrate production. Examples may include acetone, butane, isopropyl alcohol, pentane, etc. Inhaling them can damage your brain, liver, and kidneys and cause seizures. Microbials, bacteria and fungus. Examples include Salmonella species, Shigatoxin-producing E. coli, Staphylococcus, Candida, and more listed here. Inhaling large quantities of yeast and mold in general can cause respiratory illness, particularly in the elderly and those who are immunosuppressed. If ingested, the bacteria named can also cause food poisoning, acute renal failure, anemia, and neurological problems. Mycotoxins. Mycotoxins are emitted by specific fungi and can reside in a product without being visible to the naked eye. They can remain after the lifetime of the organism. If ingested, they can cause acute poisoning, immune deficiency, and cancer. Pesticides. Colorado requires testing for 13 different insecticides and fungicides. In some cases, you may see that the list is 15, and that is because 2 of the pesticides have different chemical forms. Collective health risks. Topical reactions, respiratory illness, neurotoxicity, organ damage, and cancer. Know what you're applying, read the label, and check the name of the product against the Colorado Department of Agriculture's list of pesticides approved for use. Heavy metals. Colorado requires testing for arsenic, cadmium, lead, and mercury. Collectively, they can have similar health risks to those for pesticides. Heavy metals can come from many sources, such as soil, core matting, fertilizers, or water. Because cannabis plants hyperaccumulate metals, if available to the plant, they will concentrate in the plant's tissues.
Cross-contamination, a review of cross-contamination as it relates to sample collection. What is cross-contamination? Cross-contamination is the physical transfer of a contaminant from one place to another. In practice, this means if a contaminant is present in one harvest batch or sample, it can be transferred to a clean batch or sample via the sampler equipment, or environment. Pesticides in particular are sticky, and some can remain on a product or surface for months. The risk: cross-contamination can potentially lead to batch failure. What is cross-contamination and how does it occur? In sampling, common sources of cross-contamination are not properly using gloves, bare hand contact with product, not washing hands properly, unclean contact surfaces and/or not properly sanitized surfaces, tools and equipment that come in contact with product materials. Preventing cross-contamination during sampling. Hand washing. Wash hands with soap and warm water for a total of 20 seconds before and after sampling. Wet hands and arms. Use running water as hot as you can comfortably stand it. Apply soap, enough to build up a good lather. Scrub hands and arms vigorously. Scrub them for 10 to 15 seconds. Clean under fingernails and between fingers. Rinse hands and arms thoroughly. Use warm running water. Dry hands and arms using paper towels or a drying device. Never use your uniform to dry your hands. Ensure you're stocked with soap and paper towels or a drying device for hands. Use clean, disposable gloves. Never reuse gloves. Change gloves between harvest batches, and if a sample you have touched looks suspect. Designated sample collection area. An area that has been designated within the limited access area of a marijuana cultivation facility or a marijuana products manufacturer. This area is under surveillance and used for organizing and combining sample increments to create test batches. It should be cleaned and sanitized prior to preparing test batches. Ensure it is free of any plant debris and that the contact surface has been cleaned with a sanitizer such as 70% isopropyl alcohol. Spray and wipe down contact surfaces in between sampling different harvest batches. Disinfectants need to contact the surface and remain wet for at least 20 seconds before drying or evaporation. Keep area clear of items like cell phones, drinks, or other items that have come in touch with bare hands. Preparing utensils. Use clean utensils that have been washed, rinsed, and sanitized with isopropyl alcohol or equivalent. Alcohols used to disinfect should be between 70 and 80% alcohol. If it is too diluted, 70%, it may not be effective at disinfection. If it is too concentrated, 80%, it will evaporate too quickly to be effective. Ensure utensils are dried prior to use by letting them air dry or utilizing a chemically clean, lint-free cloth, such as a Kim wipe. Use new or cleaned utensils between harvest batches. Correct examples of containers for samples. Place samples only in clean, dry, leak-proof containers, such as whirl packs, vials, etc. Ensure that individual samples cannot come in contact with another during transfer. Containers must be clear and have at least 20% empty space. See photos provided in slide. Examples of incorrect containers for samples. Samples in packaging that does not seal, unsturdy packaging, opaque containers, liquid samples in bags. Sample collection, the purpose of sample collection and how it works.
Sample collection. For further explanations of terminology in this section that will be used, refer to the CDPHE sampling procedures and the MED rules. Web links are provided on a resource page at the end of this video presentation. Why sample? It is not practical or cost-effective to test every piece of product. Instead, you take samples that are meant to accurately represent the batch. Sampling plan. The best way to streamline the sampling process is to create and write down a plan prior to collecting. CDPHE's marijuana sampling SOPs, Appendix B, provide a template. Important components of this plan are sampling frequency and sampling amounts for increments and test batches. Flower examples. Examples of creating test batches from harvest batches. Sampling frequency. This is when and how often to sample. Samples should be collected for each harvest batch of each strain in their final form as outlined in the licensee's SOP. Examples of final form for flower and trim may include, but are not limited to, drying, curing, trimming, sifting, and adding ingredients or additives. It may also include creating pre-rolled joints from the harvest batch. Remember that samples can be tested for R&D at any point. Sampling amount. This is the weight and number of sample increments that are to be collected. A sample increment is 0.5 grams for flour. Multiple sample increments from a single harvest batch are combined into one container and submitted as a test batch. The minimum number of sample increments required depends on harvest batch size. Refer to this table from 4-110 of Colorado's MED rules. Step 1 in creating a sampling plan is characterizing the batch. You will need to know the total size by weight of the batch, number and types of containers, for example, turkey bags, bins, or drying racks, the strain of the harvest batch, and the harvest date. Step 2. Split the batch into portions and assign each portion a number. Batches may already be split into bags, drying racks, or other containers. Each portion should be given a number in increasing numerical order, and no portion of the batch should be excluded. Step 3. Use a random number generator to choose which portions to sample. Why use this instead of just picking? Everyone has some form of bias, and adding randomization to the process reduces this. CDPHE provides marijuana sampling spreadsheets with a tutorial for this purpose, shown at the end of this sample collection section. The spreadsheets aid in selecting sample increment locations and amounts based on user entries. Example 1. 5 pounds of trim in a single turkey bag. The harvest batch in this example is 5 pounds. According to the MED table, 8 sample increments must be collected and combined into one 4-gram test batch container. This single container will be submitted to an approved lab for all test types. In this same example, the batch size is small enough that the random number generator may not be required. However, you should still aim to maximize representativeness by sampling from different portions of the bag, an example of which is shown in this diagram. Example 2, 100 pounds of flour in 30 bins. In this case, your harvest batch size is 100 pounds. According to the same MED table, a total of 43 sample increments must be collected from the batch and combined into one 21.5 gram test batch container. Again, this single container will be submitted to an approved lab for all test types. To randomize sampling in this same example, assign a different number to each bin, as was shown earlier. Then use the random number generator to determine which bins to sample from. Example 3, fresh frozen. Fresh frozen can be sampled in the same way as turkey bags or bins were described earlier. One difference is that regions within the bag may be more difficult to sample. Just do your best to get a representative sample. Example 4, pre-rolls. Pre-rolls should be submitted for testing in their final form, meaning the entire pre-rolled joint should be submitted. One method of representative sampling is to give each pre-roll or box of pre-rolls a unique number, then use the same random number generator as described earlier. Concentrate examples. Examples of creating test batches of concentrates from production batches. Example 1, 1.5 pounds of shatter on a tray. In this example, the production batch size is 1.5 pounds. According to this MED table, 8 sample increments must be collected and combined into one 2-gram test batch submitted in a single clear container. Divide the slab of shatter into 4 regions and randomly pull 2 sample increments from each region. Example 2, 4 pounds of wax in 3 Pyrex dishes. In this example, the production batch is 4 pounds. According to the table, 15 sample increments must be collected and combined into one 3.75 gram test batch submitted in a single clear container. Divide each Pyrex dish into 6 regions and randomly pull a sample increment from 5 of each of the 6 regions from each dish. Example 3, 20 pounds of CO2 oil in 1 Pyrex. In this example, the production batch is 20 pounds. According to the table, 33 sample increments must be collected and combined into one 8.25 gram test batch submitted in a single clear container. Divide the Pyrex into top, middle, and bottom sections vertically, as well as into left and right half sections horizontally. Use a long pipette or other utensil to pull 5 to 6 random sample increments from each of the 6 regions. Product examples. Examples of creating test batches of products from production batches. Example 1, 100,000 gummies in units of 10 servings each. In this example, the production batch is 100,000 servings. According to this MED table, a minimum of 53 sample increments must be collected and packaged into final units. Because products must be submitted in final packaging, 60 sample increments will end up being collected to total 6 full 10-serving units. Divide the production batch in thirds and randomly pull 20 servings from each third. The 6 units will be submitted as one test batch. Example 2, 100,000 gummies in 20 serving units. The production batch for this example is 100,000 servings. According to this MED table, a minimum of 53 sample increments must be collected and packaged into final units. Because products must be submitted in final packaging, 60 sample increments will end up being collected to total 3 full units. Divide the production batch into thirds and randomly pull 20 servings from each third. The 3 units will be submitted as one test batch.
Welcome to the CDPHE sampling spreadsheet instructional video. This short video will walk you through how to use the spreadsheet to collect sample increments for the purposes of creating a test batch in accordance with Colorado Marijuana Enforcement Division MED Rules 1 CCR 212-3 and the CDPHE sampling procedure. This spreadsheet is intended to be used in combination with the sampling instructions outlined in the applicable CDPHE sampling procedure. It will identify the correct number of sample increments to collect based upon the size of the batch being sampled and randomly select locations across the various containers in which the batch is stored. We will start by demonstrating how to use this spreadsheet to sample marijuana concentrates. Click the Concentrate tab and navigate to the column labeled Batch ID and enter the production batch ID. In the next column, enter the weight of the production batch in pounds. For example, if you have a 100-pound production batch, enter 100. The spreadsheet will calculate the weight of the batch in grams. Based on the weight, the spreadsheet will also determine the total number of sample increments required as per MED rule. In this case, 53 sample increments are required. Rule also requires that each sample increment be 250 milligrams in weight. So, 53 times 250 milligrams will give you a total test batch size of 13.25 grams. For this example, 53 sample increments should be collected using the guidelines in the CDPHE concentrate sampling procedure. Ensure samples are collected as randomly as possible throughout the container, such as sampling increments from the top, middle, and bottom regions of the container. And ensure sampling occurs across all containers if the batch is stored in more than one container. Now we will demonstrate how to use the spreadsheet for marijuana product sampling. Click the Infused Product tab and navigate to the column labeled Production Batch ID. Enter the batch ID. Similar to the Concentrate tab, the size of the production batch must be entered in the adjacent column. However, rather than entering the batch weight, enter the total number of single-serving or single-use units in the production batch. For example, if your production batch is 1,000 single-serving products, enter 1,000 here. As defined by MED rule, a batch of 1,000 single-serving units requires 15 sample increments to create a test batch. You can see the spreadsheet populate this value here. Samples need to be collected randomly throughout the batch, so the spreadsheet instructs you to collect 5 units from the beginning, 5 units from the middle, and 5 from the end. If it is not possible to determine which samples were produced first and which were produced last, the batch could simply be divided into thirds. For products containing multiple servings, such as infused chocolate bars, navigate to the Multi-Serving Product tab and enter the total number of servings in the production batch. For example, if you have a production batch of 100 chocolate bars, each containing 10 milligram servings, the production batch contains a total of 1,000 servings. Enter 1,000. The spreadsheet will output the minimum number of units required and the corresponding number of sample increments. As you can see, a batch of 1,000 multi-serving products would require submission of 2 units, that is, 2 chocolate bars, or a total of 20 servings sample increments. The sampler would need to collect 2 random samples, one from the beginning and one from the middle or end of the production batch. Now we will demonstrate how to use this spreadsheet for flower sampling. The Flower Instruction tab includes written instructions on how to use the Flower tab for reference. Click on the Flower tab and enter the Harvest Batch ID. Similar to the Concentrate tab, you must enter the weight of the harvest batch in pounds. If you have a 10-pound harvest batch, enter 10 here, and the spreadsheet will output that 15 sample increments are required, and the total minimum weight of the test batch must be 7.5 grams. Navigate to the Flower Location Instructions tab. This tab provides written instructions on how to perform the next steps in the Flower Locations tab, which we will walk through now. Navigate to the Flower Locations tab and enter the total number of sample increments required as provided in the Flower tab. In this example, a 10-pound batch would require 15 sample increments. In the total number of sample increments tab, enter 15. The number of containers in which the harvest batch is stored must be entered in column D. This number will vary by each unique facility. The CDPHE marijuana flower sampling procedure provides guidance on determining the appropriate number of sampling locations in a variety of containers. For example, if the harvest batch is stored in drying racks, you might divide each tray into 5 regions or sampling locations. If the harvest batch is in bags or bins, you might divide the bin or bag into 8 regions, 3 across the top, and then moving throughout the depth, 2 in the middle, and 3 across the bottom. However the container is divided, it is important to create these sampling locations spatially throughout the container. For this example, let's assume that the harvest batch is in 7 drying rack trays, and we will define 5 sampling locations within each tray. You must manually update the spreadsheet to reflect the number of containers and sampling locations. Navigate to column H, input the total number of sampling locations per tray, in this case 1 through 5. Column G represents the storage containers being sampled. In this example, each drying tray has 5 possible sublocations to sample from, and therefore needs to be represented in 5 rows. So enter 1 for the drying tray 1 5 times. Continue filling in the sampling locations and container IDs until the total number of trays is represented in our example, 7. The user then must click and drag to copy columns I through N to expand the rows of the table covering the total number of containers and sampling locations. The spreadsheet generates a random number in column I, and then it ranks those numbers to randomly select samples in a manner that is distributed across the batch. Locations selected for sampling are indicated here in column M as yes values. No values indicate locations that should not be sampled from. The sampler would need to collect sample increments from locations 1, 2 in tray 1, 2 in tray 2, and 5 in tray 2, and so on. We can see here that by collecting a sample increment of 0.5 grams from each of the sampling locations with a yes in column M, you will collect the required 15 sample increments and a total test batch size of 7.5 grams. So although columns I through L may appear complex, they are just the formulas used to randomize sampling across the batch. This helps create a test batch that is representative of the harvest batch. By sampling evenly amongst the different storage containers in a completely random manner, we keep that statistical power. Now, let's look at one more example. Returning to the Flower tab, let's say this time we have a 100-pound harvest batch. So enter 100 in column B. The spreadsheet determines we need 43 sample increments and a total of 21.5 grams. Return to the Flour Locations tab. Let's delete most of the cells from our previous example. Now enter 43 for the total number of sample increments. Now, let's say this batch is stored in 4 turkey bags. So enter 4 for the number of storage containers. And let's say we've defined 8 sampling locations within each bag as per the CDPHE marijuana flower sampling procedure. You'll notice that, in this instance, the spreadsheet is telling you that something went wrong. The cell is comparing the required number of sample increments to the number of total possible sampling locations. In this example, we need 43 sample increments, but because we have 4 bags and 8 sampling locations within each bag, we only have a maximum possible number of 32 locations to collect each sample increment. If this occurs, you will need to redefine how many sampling locations you have per storage container. Remember that the CDPHE marijuana flower sampling procedure provides guidance on good strategies for sampling throughout containers. So if we redefine the sampling locations within each container, we can update the spreadsheet to reflect this. Let's say we now have 12 defined sampling locations within each bag, giving us 48 sampling locations. Column O changes to good to use now that we have a sufficient number of sampling locations from which to collect the sample increments. We have now identified our required 43 sample increments and 21.5 total grams. A sample increment should be collected from each location within each bag as indicated by the yes in column M. A copy of the final template should be saved as a PDF as part of your sampling records. This concludes the tutorial. Thank you for watching.
After collecting sample increments and creating test batches, store them appropriately prior to and during transport. Transport to an approved lab within an appropriate amount of time, 2 days according to CDPHE sampling procedures. Things to consider. First, temperature. Hot or fluctuating temperatures can change the chemical composition of a product. Test batches from products that will be sold at room temperature should be stored at 6 degrees plus or minus 4 degrees Celsius prior to and during transport to labs. Fresh frozen test batches should be stored at 0 degrees plus or minus 4 degrees Celsius. Second, consider proper labeling, paperwork, and custody seals, including your metric tag, such as shown here. Finally, secure leak-proof containers are needed. R&D testing. Remember that no two grows or manufacturing facilities are alike. The examples provided in the previous slides serve as guidance for collecting sample increments and creating test batches for required testing. You may wish to collect additional test batches and send them in for R&D testing if your facility has experienced past contamination issues, a test batch failed and you want to see if your decontamination method worked, portions of your harvest batch or production batch appear physically different from others, you suspect a portion of a batch has been compromised. Remember that R&D testing can be performed prior to or in between required testing. R&D test batch amounts must only meet the minimum requirements of the lab to which they are being submitted.
Documentation. Review of sample collection documentation and record-keeping requirements. As part of the sample increment collection process, the following information should be retained for a period of the current year and the preceding 3 years after analysis has been completed. Sample plan, associated designated test batch collector attestations, metric transportation manifest. The CDPHE provides a template for the sample plan in Appendix B of the marijuana sampling procedure. Sampling procedure and locations can be described with printouts from the sampling location spreadsheet. Required sample increment collection training. To become a designated test batch collector, an owner licensee or employee licensee involved in the sample increment collection of regulated marijuana must be designated by a manager or training from a third-party vendor. Nothing in this rule requires a designated test batch collector to be employed by the regulated marijuana business making the designation. Designated test batch collection training required topics. The training required to become a designated test batch collector must include at least the following: Part 4-100 Rule Series, Regulated Marijuana Testing Program, the marijuana business's standard operating procedures on creating a sampling plan and test batches, and the CDPHE's sampling procedures. This training video or an equivalent training covering the following subjects: Introduction to sample increment collection, cross-contamination as it relates to sample increment collection, sample increment collection and how it works, sample increment collection documentation and record-keeping requirements, penalties for sample increment or test batch adulteration or alteration, use of and disinfection of the designated sample collection area, use of the sampling plan. Documentation of designated test batch collector training. Any individual receiving the designated test batch collector training must sign and date a document which shall be maintained by the regulated marijuana business as a business record pursuant to Rule 3-905. The document must acknowledge the following: the identity of the person that created the training, such as the regulated marijuana business or third-party vendor, and that all required topics of the training identified in this rule have been reviewed and understood by the owner licensee or employee licensee. The CDPHE provides a template for this in Appendix C of the marijuana sampling procedures. Penalties. A review of penalties for sample alteration. Rules. Inadequate sampling is addressed in Colorado's Criminal Code and by the Marijuana Enforcement Division. Adulteration or alteration of test batches is a Class 2 misdemeanor charge on the individual who committed the act. Colorado's Criminal Code 44-10-701 3B and 9 states, "It is unlawful for a person licensed pursuant to this Article 10 to knowingly adulterate or alter or attempt to adulterate or alter any samples of regulated marijuana or regulated marijuana products for the purpose of circumventing contaminant testing detection limits or potency testing requirements." Colorado's Criminal Code 44-10-701 9 states, "A person who commits any acts that are unlawful pursuant to this Article 10 commits a Class 2 misdemeanor and shall be punished as provided in Section 18-1.3-501, except that a violation of subsection 5A of this section is a Class 1 misdemeanor and shall be punished as provided in Section 18-1.3-501 for violations that would also constitute a violation of Title 18. The violation shall be charged and prosecuted pursuant to Title 18 CRS 44-10-701. MED Rule 4-110A3 states, "Adulteration or alteration prohibited." Pursuant to Section 44-10-701 3B and 9 CRS, it is unlawful for a licensee or its agent to knowingly adulterate or alter, or attempt to adulterate or alter any sample increments or test batches of regulated marijuana for the purpose of circumventing contaminant testing detection limits or potency testing requirements. The sample increments collected and submitted for testing must be representative of the harvest batch or production batch being tested. A violation of this subparagraph of A3 shall be considered a license violation affecting public safety, and the person who commits adulteration or alteration of sample increments or test batches commits a Class 2 misdemeanor and may be punished as provided in Section 18-1.3-501 CRS. Additionally, MED Rule 4-110A4 states, "Timing of sample increments for harvest batches and production batches. A licensee shall not collect sample increments or submit test batches for testing until the test batch has completed all required steps and is in its final form as outlined in the standard operating procedures of the licensee submitting the test batch, with the exception of packaging and labeling requirements, which shall comply with Rule 3-1000 25.
Violations and penalties. Inadequate sampling could lead to violations and penalties to individual employees and the regulated marijuana business. Individuals may be charged with a Class 2 misdemeanor. Businesses may receive the most serious violation, violation affecting public safety, or other license violations. Violations affecting public safety. 8-235A1 Penalty Schedule. License violations affecting public safety. This category of violation is the most severe and may include, but is not limited to, retail marijuana sales to persons under the age of 21 years, medical marijuana sales to non-patients consuming marijuana on the licensed premises, regulated marijuana sales in excess of the relevant sales limitations, permitting the diversion of regulated marijuana outside the regulated distribution system, possessing marijuana obtained from outside the regulated distribution system or from an unauthorized source, making misstatements or omissions in the inventory tracking system, failure to report any transfer required by Section 44-10-313-11, knowingly adulterating or altering or attempting to adulterate or alter any samples of regulated marijuana, violations related to co-located medical marijuana businesses and retail marijuana businesses, violations related to R&D co-location permits, failure to maintain books and records to fully account for all transactions of the business, failure to cooperate with division investigators during the course of a division investigation, failure to comply with any requirement related to the transfer of sampling units, utilizing advertising material that is misleading, deceptive, or false, advertising violations directly targeting minors, or packaging or labeling violations that directly impact patient or consumer safety. Violations of this nature generally have an immediate or potential negative impact on the health, safety, and welfare of the public at large. The range of penalties for this category of violation may include license suspension, a fine per individual violation, a fine in lieu of suspension of up to $100,000, and/or license revocation, depending on the mitigating and aggravating circumstances. Sanctions may also include restrictions on the license. License violations. 8-235A2 Penalty Schedule. License violations. This category of violation is more severe than a license infraction, but generally does not have an immediate or potential negative impact on the health, safety, and welfare of the public at large. License violations may include, but are not limited to, advertising and/or marketing violations, packaging or labeling violations that do not directly impact patient or consumer safety, failing to continuously escort a visitor in a limited access area, failure to maintain minimum security requirements, failure to keep and maintain adequate business books and records, or minor or clerical errors in the inventory tracking system. The range of penalties for this category of violation may include license suspension, a fine per individual violation, a fine in lieu of suspension of up to $50,000, and/or license revocation, depending on the mitigating and aggravating circumstances. Sanctions may also include restrictions on the license. Forms of violations. Sample alteration. An example is oxidizing, bleaching, or microwaving a flower sample to pass total yeast and mold testing. If this treatment is not done to the entire batch, as it will be sold, but only submitted for testing, it violates the assumption that your sample represents the actual finished product. Another example of sample alteration is dusting with keef, for example, to change potency results. Again, if this treatment is not done to the entire batch as it will be sold, it violates the assumption that the sample represents the actual finished product. Cherry picking sample increments. Cherry picking means non-randomly picking what you think would be a good sample increment. For example, if you just chose the bud at the top of a plant, which could potentially have higher potency than the side buds. Again, this violates the assumption that your sample represents the batch as a whole. In summary, test batches submitted should be representative of the finished product in final form. Sample increments within one test batch should be submitted in one container with a single metric tag. Where possible, submit one test batch for all required tests instead of submitting a different test batch per test. Test batches can be tested as R&D at any point in the process. Resources. For further information on CDPHE sampling procedures, Colorado MED rules, Colorado's metric system, the CDA's approved list of pesticides, and the MED inquiry form where you can submit questions, follow these links.